everyone, and thank you, Seth. This morning, we're going to discuss the inclusion of a historically underserved population, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in medical education.
All right, this is Emily Noonan. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. I'm sorry, Dr. Harris, did you want to go ahead and review the learning objectives?
No, that's all right. You can go ahead.
Okay, all right, great. Thanks. So what I'm going to do is give some background. In order to understand the health disparities that we see with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or ID, we have to understand the history, right? So historically, society has had very low expectations of people with ID, seeing them as incapable of engaging in the community or engaging in full social life. The results of poor care, social segregation, isolation, institutionalization meant that many did not live past the age of 20. The disability, and I'll sort of go through this process where the disability rights movement comes to the fore, comes to be, and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are integrated into the community. So we'll see this sort of shift from isolation and poor care to good care and community integration. So a way to do this is to look at conceptual models that have been used to understand disability. And these are still used to understand disability. I want to note that we're talking today about a contemporary North American and European approach to disability. So the frameworks that I'm going to talk about, I mean, they are limited because they don't incorporate sort of the long and diverse and complex histories of health and healing in Africa, Asia, and indigenous Australia and the Americas. You know, models can be really, really useful to understand social phenomenon, but they are also a simplification. So at the end, I'll sort of challenge you to think about the ways that these overlap. But they matter. Conceptual models matter because they they shape how we think about the cause of disability, the meaning of disability, and how we respond to disability. I'm going to start with the moral model. So this is the model that dominated, and I mean, it still exists, and I'm sure you've encountered it. Disability is understood in moral terms, as a sign of good or bad, and really dominated before the development of medicine or biomedicine as a profession. So how, so the cause of disability could be supernatural forces, gods, witches. It could be seen as a sin, a result of sin, or it could be this result of a blessing. And the response was, prayer, stigma, isolation, banishment. And the authorities here on disability would be priests and healers. And there's variability in how people with disabilities are treated under this model. But as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, institutionalization was a common response. So as medicine develops into a profession that's built around scientific principles, so 18th, 19th century, the approach to disability really shifts to a medical model. So disability is understood in medical terms. The cause is the effect of a health condition, disease, or trauma, and the appropriate response is cure or treatment. And the authorities really are clinicians and medical institutions. The key here to think about is the idea that the quote-unquote problem of disability is at the level of the individual, right? So the goal should be to cure the individual or prevent something in the individual. And here, in terms of treatment, people with ID, institutionalization is still very, very common and is still a central approach. Eugenics also is key here, with the forced sterilization of people with disabilities as the idea of prevention in the individual is key. In the 1970s and in the United States and the United Kingdom, the social model comes to the fore. And so here, disability is understood as the result of ableism, or the assumption that able-bodiedness is superior or desired. The cause is not the individual. The cause is not the biological or bodily difference. The problem is the barriers that are put in place by society. So the real problem would be, that the built environment doesn't have ramps, that communication generally doesn't include closed captioning, that no one who is hearing is taught basic ASL, right? So the response would be not changing individuals, but changing social structure. And so a weakness of this approach is that at its most extreme form, it rejects the medical model. The medical model has its issues, but also has utility in reducing suffering and improving functioning in people with disabilities. What is the greatest strength of this social model really is its role in the disability rights movement. So in terms of the treatment of people with ID, you see deinstitutionalization, massive deinstitutionalization, an end to eugenics, pushing for community integration, pushing for care in families or communities. So that can be families of care, that can be blood families, or it could be families of choice. So people to care for you. The culmination is really the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, which it's only 30 years old. So it was signed into law in 1990. All right. And so to differentiate between the medical model and the social model, in the medical model, the problem is the individual, and the social model, the problem is social structures. I'm going to sort of end with the functional model. So the functional model brings together the medical and the social. It's also called the biopsychosocial model. Here, disability is caused by interactions between health conditions and the environment. And the goal is not just to treat the disability, to treat the individual, and the goal is not just to change society, but to do both. So to prioritize function to meet patient goals. A key document and key movement here is World Health Organization, International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. So that's a good source to start with. And again, community integration and helping individuals meet their goals is key. Okay, so what about conceptual models? Why review them? Why bother? I argue that they're absolutely key to understanding how people with disabilities are treated, what their roles in society are, what their responsibilities are, what the responsibilities of able-bodied people are to people with ID, what restrictions are placed on people with ID, and really you're going to see through conceptual models, whether the result is isolation, marginalization, and institutionalization, or integration into the community and the ability to exercise autonomy and agency. Also, I want to, at the beginning I said models can be kind of general. They overlap. If you think about your life, your cases, the patients you meet, the families you meet, I would bet that you see each of these models in the way that people understand disabilities and the way that you might understand different disabilities. Historically, medical education has relied on the medical model, but this is limiting. So we really want to bring your attention to the social model and to that functional model, as we believe that it can be really key in reducing health disparities. So with that background, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harris, who is going to dig into contemporary health disparities experienced by people with ID.
Thank you. The past closing of institutions in support of the integration of people with ID into their own communities has been one contributor to an increased lifespan among people with ID. However, people with intellectual disabilities continue to face barriers to health as healthcare systems have been slow to keep pace with social changes. People with ID remain one of the most medically underserved groups in the world and still face significant health disparities not directly caused by their disability. 1 in 4 people living in the United States has an intellectual or developmental disability, which includes anything, either mental or physical, that limits functional capacity. In fact, disabilities are so common that the World Health Organization has concluded that a disability is a natural feature of the human condition. Currently, more than 97% of people with disabilities live in the community, not in nursing homes, hospitals, or other institutions. Intellectual disability refers to a disability that originates before age 18 years and is characterized by significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and in adaptive behaviors. It's important to realize that there's a variety in how intellectual disability is defined. For example, the definition from the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities specifies that the disability originates before age 18. However, the DSM-5 definition is less specific. Let's break down the definition further. Intellectual functioning refers to general mental capacity, which can be measured by an IQ test. An IQ test score of less than 70 to 75 indicates a limitation in intellectual functioning. Adaptive behaviors refer to skills that are needed to live, work, and play in the community. These include communication, self-care, social skills, or put another way, adaptive behaviors are the conceptual, social, and practical skills that people learn and perform in their everyday lives. By definition, someone with intellectual and developmental disability experiences significant limitations in both intellectual functioning and adaptive behaviors. It's important to remember that most people who have intellectual disability are only mildly impaired. But despite this fact, many in the public believe that people with ID aren't capable of participating in activities like inclusive sports or attending inclusive schools. Also, functionally, people with mild ID are likely capable of making familiar medical decisions. Health and healthcare disparities refer to preventable or avoidable differences in health and healthcare between groups of people. Disparities are typically experienced by vulnerable populations as a result of poorer access to and poorer quality of healthcare. A health disparity refers to a higher burden of illness, injury, disability, or mortality experienced by one group relative to another. A healthcare disparity refers to differences between groups, access to care, use of care, or quality of care. Due to a range of systemic challenges, including inadequate provider training, inaccessible facilities, people with intellectual disability have less access to quality health care and health promotion programs. As a result, people with ID experience dramatically higher rates of preventable health issues than peers without intellectual disability. According to the National Council on Disability, people with ID face a constellation of health and healthcare disparities, including inadequate health and wellness promotion, inconsistent access to high-quality healthcare services. People with intellectual disabilities are much more likely than their counterparts without to have a myriad of chronic health conditions. They're 5 times more likely to have diabetes, twice as likely to die before age 50, twice as likely to be obese, 3 times more likely to be admitted to the hospital on presentation to an emergency department, twice as likely to have a diagnosis of cardiovascular disease or asthma, and 3 times more likely to have a diagnosis of arthritis. People with intellectual disability are perfectly capable of being healthy, but typically experience significant barriers to achieving equitable health. These include attitudinal barriers such as stigma, stereotypes, misconceptions related to having a disability. For example, public health departments may not include people with ID in their health promotion efforts based on their implicit bias that people with ID can't improve their own health. Communication barriers include ways in which communications aren't accessible to people with ID, such as use of complicated or technical language, long sentences, text-heavy dense forms, or words with many syllables. Policy barriers arise from a lack of laws and regulations requiring equal care access or lack of enforcement of existing laws. Programmatic barriers arise when organizations fail to make reasonable accommodations to their programs or operations for people with disabilities. Social barriers relate to the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, learn, work, and age, also known as social determinants of health. These barriers include lack of financial resources, unemployment, lack of stable housing, and the experience of abuse. Physical barriers include structural barriers that impair and physically block mobility and physical access to services. This list of barriers outlines a complex and interrelated set of individual, provider, health system, societal, and environmental factors that combine to contribute to disparities in health and healthcare for people with intellectual disability. In the past, I considered myself an advocate for health equality, but after having the opportunity to engage in the care of patients with disabilities, I realized that what I'm actually interested in is promoting health equity. Health equity and health equality, though related, aren't the same. Health equality means giving everyone the same thing, whereas equity means giving people what they need to reach their best health. This slide represents an example. Here are 4 individuals of different heights and abilities who are all given a bicycle to ride. In order to treat them equally, they would all be given the same size and type of bike. However, doing so wouldn't help the tallest person or the smallest person or the person with a physical disability ride the bike. In order to give equitable treatment, each person needs to be given a bicycle of the correct size and type to fit their body. Thus, health equity means that everyone shouldn't have the same resources, but instead have the necessary resources to achieve optimal health outcomes. Providing the same type of resources to all people is not enough. In order to reduce the health disparities gap, the underlying issues and individual needs of underserved and vulnerable populations must be effectively addressed. Supporting health equity requires addressing barriers that prevent the inclusion of people with disabilities in health programs, policies, and services. Inclusive health strives for health equity and is founded on the idea that health disparities can be addressed by removing barriers and appropriately including all people with intellectual disability in the mainstream healthcare system, health promotion, and public health efforts. Inclusive policies and practices can effectively address, reduce, and often eliminate many health barriers. Inclusion allows people with intellectual disability to take full advantage of the benefits of the same health programs and services experienced by people who don't have ID, resulting in improved health outcomes for people with intellectual disability. A 2009 survey of 2,500 U.S. medical and dental school deans, residency directors, and students revealed that at the time of the survey, 81% of graduating medical students in the United States reported not having received any clinical training on the care of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and 90% of U.S. primary care residency programs offered no training in caring for people with IDD. And now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Chandon.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Hi, everybody. So Dr. Noonan and Dr. Harris have kind of given us the background, both in terms of conceptual models of disability as well as a little bit about the health disparities that we see. So my focus of the talk is talking about efforts to address health disparities. And in order to address health disparities that we see, we have to address the root causes at multiple levels. In this particular case, I'm going to focus on the root cause of lack of physician training, and I'll be talking about 3 different efforts that all relate to addressing that root cause. So the National Curriculum Initiative in Developmental Medicine is the first effort that I'll talk about. And Dr. Noonan, as well as Dr. Harris, are part of our team here. And so this is a nationwide effort, but the sort of the epicenter of it is actually here in Louisville at U of L. And so this project is a multi-year partnership between the American Academy of Developmental Medicine and Dentistry and Special Olympics with resources from the CDC. And so the purpose of this project is to provide training to medical students in the field of developmental medicine, so the care of individuals with IDD across the lifespan. And so the focus is, really that lifespan in terms of care. We know that there are efforts sort of, especially in pediatrics throughout the nation, but oftentimes on the adult side, people with IDD are not a population that adult providers discuss. So really intentional in integrating all different fields of medicine and making sure that we cover that lifespan approach. And so essentially the project is a grant program where medical school partners receive a grant, and their charge is to implement curriculum enhancements as well as evaluate the efforts that they put in place. We currently have 20 medical school partners, which is approximately 10%. That was our goal at the beginning of this project during the planning phases in 2015, 2016, looking at the idea of the tipping point. What number of schools do we need to involve in this type of model to get real systems change? And we were aiming for around 10%, and we're really excited that that's where we have landed. So you can see the medical school partners here, and you'll notice that there's growth. So that concept of the tipping point, we sort of saw borne out in real time, where the first cohort, U of L was in cohort 1, and as we progressed, we started to engage more and more schools and started to get more and more interest and excitement in joining this initiative. Within these schools that you see listed here, there's a wide variety in terms of starting place. So some of the schools had very robust disability curriculum. Some had none at all. Some had disability curriculum but only focused on a particular type of disability. So it really was sort of a wide variety of a starting point. The charge to the school was tell us about what you have in place and tell us about the enhancements you plan to make. And so the nature of this funding effort is specific to intellectual and developmental disability. However, it's an opportunity for schools to talk about disability more broadly and conceptual models of disability like Dr. Noonan talked about. As Dr. Harris mentioned, 1 in 4 people in the United States have a disability. And then as you sort of break that down, IDD, it's about 6.5 million in the United States. But so really the schools used the intentional inclusion of IDD. So if they were talking about disability, they made sure to include IDD. If they were not talking about disability at all, they made sure to start doing that and to include IDD. And so it was really an opportunity for the schools to take a look at their existing content and make some changes. Additionally, the important things to remember for this program is that, one, the conceptual model used is what Dr. Noonan discussed, that this entire project is formulated around a biopsychosocial model, specifically the WHO's ICF, or International Classification of Functioning and Disability. And that is the model that, so my background is physiatry or physical medicine and rehabilitation. And that's the model of disability that our field utilizes to think about our patients that have disabilities. And so that's the model in terms of how these efforts are framed. Along with that, there is an emphasis on community partnership and self-advocates. All of the schools listed here have activities where self-advocates, so people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are serving as co-teachers. And that's really sort of, to me, it's surprising that that is novel, but it is in fact novel because typically people with IDD are not invited into our medical education spaces. And so to create space for them is a pretty powerful advancement in terms of medical education. Additionally, we also use a lens of intersectionality. So all of the schools are sort of encouraged and taught, and their activities are reviewed to make sure that they are being intersectional in their approach. And what I mean by that is that that's a new term, is that disability is part of a person's identity, but it may only be one part. All of us have different identities that we sort of see ourselves. And it's important as a provider to talk to your patients and understand how they see themselves. With what communities do they identify? And sometimes identities are ones that you can see, such as race or disability in terms of physical disability. Sometimes an identity is invisible in terms of other types of disability. And so we make sure to kind of talk to all the schools about this. So in reality, it is an IDD effort, but it's really engaged with that broader conversation of health equity. So for those who are visual, here's sort of the map. The red are the funded partners. The purple are, we were able to incorporate 2 partners that were able to utilize belonging to something like this to leverage that and go get their own funding. So they're not funded by the cooperative agreement with CDC, but we brought them into the fold. Currently, in the past 2 weeks, we're also bringing on 3 different schools in California, so trying to flesh out the West Coast representation here. So in terms of the project, it's a flexible approach. So all the schools propose their activities, but then they're free to kind of integrate activities that fit their local context. And so we see a variety of simulation, didactic, community engaged, and clinical education activities. And so I'll talk a little bit about these, but each school is doing something different. And that's intentional because we want these to essentially be different pilots to be able to come away with best practices and lessons learned. So in terms of reach, our cohorts 1 through 3 in sum will reach about 2,000 medical students, and then this last cohort that's underway now will also reach about 2,000. So that growth I mentioned previously, we've really seen that. We feel like we've hit that tipping point. So our total impact for this phase of the project will be about 4,000 medical students reached. In terms of next steps, so the medical school partners all sort of agree to collaborate. It's a collaborative effort. And so they're currently sharing materials with each other in a password protected portal. Just, you know, within academia, sometimes sharing is a challenge, but so we have that set up for them to share with each other. And the goal after this cohort 4 wraps up is for all 20 plus medical schools to work together to come up with what we affectionately refer to as curriculum in a box. So it will be for schools that are interested in this content but maybe don't have that local champion or local expertise. It will have, you know, so you want to do an elective, here's the syllabus, here's the reading list, here are examples of partners. Or so you want to do a patient panel, here's sample questions, here's organizations to reach out to partner with to do that. And so we're excited about that, and we're going to be working on these efforts until this is something that is covered in medical school, you know, across the nation. No presentation in 2020, I feel like, would be complete without a little bit about coronavirus. And so I will say that, you know, managing a nationwide project here from Louisville during a global pandemic has been interesting, to say the least. What we've really seen is that the impact of the pandemic varies by location. So some of our schools, in particular Stony Brook and University of Arizona, were some of the most affected. Stony Brook, for example, actually had to graduate all of their medical students early in April so that they could join the workforce because the situation there was quite dire. In general, we've noted that the themes were that clinic-based activities were suspended, face-to-face meetings with self-advocates and community members were postponed, but what happened was we saw a lot of content being moved online, similar to how Grand Rounds today is virtual. So our schools have done a really great job of adapting to these challenges, and we find that our self-advocates, our people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, are far more tech savvy than the majority of us faculty, and so they've really been sort of leading the way in teaching us in how to engage with students in a virtual environment. So I'm going to talk just briefly about community engagement because NCIDM truly is a project that is community engaged. And so the definition for community engagement, there's several, but the one from the CDC that I list here is working collaboratively with groups of people that are united, whether that's by geographic proximity, a special interest, or similar situations. And the goal is to address the well-being of that group of people. So within a community, you're going to have multiple different stakeholders that have slightly different perspectives, but at the end of the day, what brings them all together is their interest in the well-being, or in our case, the health equity of a group of people, in our case, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. On this slide here, I've got a picture of 3 of our self-advocates, Hayden, Katie, and Morgan. Some of the medical students on the call may recognize these folks because they have come and spoken to our students. So community engaged research, important to remember that this is a framework or an approach. It's not a methodology. So you can integrate community engaged research principles into any research activity that you are doing. And those principles are that there is a recognition and sort of a building on community strengths. So you recognize that the people with expertise in the area you are working on are the people that identify with that group. So the self-advocates are really sort of centered in community engaged efforts. It also stresses the importance of partnerships, so especially outside of academia, because communities generally exist outside of academia. Academia tends to be sort of an ivory tower, and there's efforts to improve that, but we have to recognize that we've been having conversations and excluding a lot of people that are important in those conversations. We also work really hard to help the researchers think about your relationship between what you do in your professional life as well as your relationship with the community. And this goes for clinicians as well. So really thinking about what is your relationship to the communities that you serve, and understanding that engagement exists on a continuum. So I bring this slide up just to share a little of my own sort of personal experience. My older brother, pictured here, Ankur, has Down syndrome. He is 38 years old, and I've been engaged with these efforts my whole life. But one of the things I'm very mindful of is my relationship to the Down syndrome community, or to the community of people with IDD. And I often have to have this conversation with parents, and I'm sure that as pediatricians, y'all are always trying to advocate for your patients, and you see them grow, you see them mature into young adults. And sometimes that balance between trying to protect your child and promoting their independence is a tricky one. And as providers, we have the opportunity to have those conversations. But so I am very frequently having the conversation within my own family, as well as with patients, that people see me as somebody that is part of the IDD community, and I remind them that, in fact, I see myself as external. I am a sister, I am a friend, but when it comes to my research work, my professional life, I do not have Down syndrome. I do not have IDD. And so for that reason, I have to be mindful of the fact that I'm still an outsider, and I have to be very intentional with my listening to people that are part of the IDD community, to our self-advocates. So this slide here is really just to kind of show a little bit about the health disparities, what Dr. Harris has already mentioned, but it's to help us kind of switch gears. So I talked about NCIDM as an initiative, and now I'm going to talk about MedFest. So this is a partnership with Special Olympics Kentucky that we're doing locally, but is also an effort that's going on sort of internationally. But so with what we're seeing is that for Special Olympics athletes, which are only a subset of people with IDD, but there's a lot of data there, so that often shapes policy because it's some of the most robust information that we have. So we're sort of aware of different health needs with regards to people with intellectual disability. And so the way to address that is Special Olympics has an initiative called Healthy Athletes. There's different initiatives for different disciplines. Dr. Harris and I work primarily in MedFest, which is the screening sports physical. So if you've ever participated in high school sports, this is the physical that you have to do to get clearance. I know as pediatricians, you guys are very familiar with a sports physical, but so the goal is to provide the pre-participation sports physicals. And intermixed with that, while the primary goal is providing that service, secondary goals are training healthcare professionals and students, as well as advocacy. So this is an opportunity for professionals, clinicians to work together, not just in the day of the event, but sort of ongoing in advocacy efforts and training efforts as well. So in terms of advocacy, I've mentioned, self-advocacy. I wanted to make sure to pay tribute to the efforts of our self-advocates. So you see a couple of them pictured here. They have both gone to Washington, D.C. to advocate before Congress. And so they're they have a lot of, a very robust skill set and are truly experts when it comes to advocacy. So I always learn a lot from them. In terms of physician advocacy, I'm going to talk a little bit about that given our audience today. But so I wanted to bring everyone's attention to a joint effort. So again, thinking about root causes, there are multiple ways that they need to be addressed. And so one of them is through that medical education project. Another that's also related to medical education, but is really housed in advocacy. And so I'm going to speak about, there's a joint effort underway between the American Academy of Pediatrics and AAPM&R through their delegations to the AMA House of Delegates. And so what this looks like, policy is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I bring this up here to show sort of how this has evolved. There's a policy of the AMA, the Medical Care of Persons with Developmental Disabilities, and it's been evolving for many, many years. Initial efforts were by AAP with pediatrics, and then AAPM&R most recently lent its voice as well to talk about some of these issues. And so the resolutions, the first one was regarding including IDD-related competencies and objectives in the curriculum. And so essentially this was done where AAP brought forth a resolution and it was passed and enacted into policy, but then there was very little movement. And so we brought this up again through AAPM&R to say, hey, let's bring this back to the forefront of the conversation because we haven't really seen the action that we were hoping for. So we were able to bring it up again and it was reaffirmed. And then added in a second resolution. So it may surprise you to learn that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are actually not considered a medically underserved population. The reason for that is that definition is per a very strict formula by HRSA, and people with IDD do not fall into it because they're not uniquely located to a single geographic area. So because of that, they are not considered a medically underserved population. But through advocacy, we were able to pass that resolution as part of the AMA. And so really, there's a lot of efforts in this area, but I think if you take away anything from today, we want you to understand that it's important to listen to self-advocates and to really think about how you see disability and sort of do self-reflection and sort of open your mind to listening to this wonderful group of people. Dr. Harris put together a really exceptional video, and I'm going to I believe the chiefs are going to be able to share that with you now.
Okay.
How would you like people to treat you when they first meet you? Really not nice. Okay. People with disabilities, it's like anybody else. Anybody?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I got disconnected. I'm getting off on Grandstand. You don't pay attention, do you? Well, I'm muted, so they can't hear me. Far behind me. Yeah, not much leeway these things.
With respect. We may have how would you like people to treat you when they first meet you?
really nice.
People with disabilities, like anybody else.
And we love to be treated with respect.
We may have a shriveled up hand or in a wheelchair, but in the end, we are ordinary people.
Even though I'm disability, I want to be treated like everyone else.
I want to have fun and play, be treated like kids.
When a doctor asks me questions and gets to know me,
You should get to know my interests. The Beatles, my two favorite rock bands in the world are the Beatles and the Beach Boys. If I got to talk about my interests with the doctors, that would make me feel more comfortable.
Get to know me.
get to know me.
There's multiple people in the room and I'm the patient. It's very important to make eye contact with the patient instead of the guardian in the room, because I can answer your question.
For me, I can tell them like how I'm feeling.
I really prefer the doctors to talk to me. I've been at a doctor's office before, and they've just talked to my mom, and my mom used to play that me. So forget them or they'll talk to her and I both, But I really prefer like them to talk to me. If not them talk to me, then talk to the bosses. But when they don't talk to me, of course, I hate to tell the doctors, but that does make me mad. Because I'm their patient, but when they do talk to me, oh boy, that makes me feel awesome inside, awesome and amazing inside.
Look at me.
Look at me.
Talk to both of us, please, not just my mom.
Talk to them while you're doing a procedure. Just make small talk. Say, what do you like to eat? What's your favorite food? What do you like to do in your free time?
Tell them what they're going to expect. Now, if they don't like what they're going to expect, then you got a problem.
They gotta know what's gonna happen, like the day of their surgery or whatever they're going through. Like how what to expect, so that way they know ahead of time what the procedure's gonna be, what they have to do before they get into the surgery room and all that stuff. Make sure they're comfortable, like don't make them uncomfortable.
It's important for me to be healthy so I can live a good life and play sports with special interest.
I felt horrible when I wasn't healthy and very active, staying healthy, eating right. I felt miserable.
Same as it is for other kids.
If you're asking to take care of someone with a disability, say yes. Awesome. My pleasure.
Say yes.
Everything now.
Say yes. You definitely need to take care of someone with disability, because they're always going to be friendly.
Go cards. That's how I end it. Go cards.
All right, thank you. So I'm sure you guys sort of heard the overall message is make sure you talk to the self-advocates, the people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Obviously, through history taking, you're going to need to gather information from other people in the room as well. But it really does mean a lot when you sort of start out talking to the patient.
The other side, right? Yeah.
And then, so the last slide we'll just leave here, but so we're happy to talk to you more about different ways to get involved. The first step would be, you know, sort of educating yourself and listening to self-advocates. There's also some online training that Dr. Harris and I can share. In terms of, you know, educating yourself and then educating others, we have active teaching sessions for medicine, as well as a couple of clinical electives, both at Home of the Innocents as well as at Lee Specialty Clinic. You can also volunteer with our team. We have an upcoming MedFest in the fall, and there's also plenty of opportunities for volunteering at the local Special Olympics program. So thank you guys for your time today. I'm going to turn it to Dr. Harris just for any concluding remarks.
Well, you know, thank you for your time. I'm sorry the video was a little glitchy, but I think the general message got across. As I asked patients what they would like, the message they would like to give to a group of doctors who might be taking care of people with intellectual disabilities, they had really similar answers, which are take your time with them, talk to them, and they can make, you know, decisions and choices and really have a lot of input into their own care. Thank you for listening.
Dr. Harris, are you still there?
Yes.
This is Marie Trace. I just wanted to say thank you for this, you and all the presenters for this fabulous grand rounds and sharing such an amazing video. And it really highlighted to me, I saw a recent article that was written by an individual with physical disabilities. And since COVID, has actually received the accommodations that she had been asking for to do her job at home, because so many people have had to do that. And so it just really spoke to me when the majority of people need it, it happens. So, so again, thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
Hi, this is Ken Schickler. As usual, I have a couple of questions or comments, and I really did enjoy the presentation. For younger people who are not in a position to be making decisions for themselves, but have different abilities, for instance, hearing impaired communities that don't see hearing impairment as a problem, but their parents choose not to do things that might improve their hearing ability because they're comfortable in their community. Are there advocate groups to help in decision making with regards to choices that could be made before our patients are old enough to make self-determined decisions? Secondly, since you're all involved with Special Olympics, one of my concerns with sports physicals in general, do you know if the physicals that are filled out by the providers are at the competitive field? So many of these kids are going to be on medications or have some special health care needs, and it would be very helpful to have the information of what medications are on, what complications they have at the field where they're competing in case there is a calamitous event. Are they present or are they just stored someplace?
I can address those questions. Thank you for your questions and comments, Dr. Schickler. So regarding the sports physical information, so we're in the process at Special Olympics Kentucky of transitioning to online. Currently it's on paper, and so for that reason it exists sort of at the office, but then at the field of play, you know, the staff members are present, but it would have to be that they sort of access that information. So we're working on ways, because you're right, it would be far more useful to have that information on file. So we're working on that currently, as well as there's efforts for the technology to be upgraded. Right now, the different disciplines are sort of uploaded into a different software system. So essentially what we're doing is working on creating what is a screening record. So like a medical record, but it's all of the screening results. So you'd be able to see the results from the dentistry screening, from MedFest, from hearing, so from all the different disciplines. So definitely working on that.
Hi, this is Gail Williams, and I really enjoyed the presentation as well. And as a developmental behavioral pediatrician, I can't tell you the number of times that as kids go into adulthood, I get reports from parents that providers often seem almost fearful of the individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities, especially if they have behavior concerns going along with that. So I think these efforts are greatly needed. As you mentioned, I think in pediatrics, we have experience working with individuals with developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities and autism spectrum disorders. And I wonder if it wouldn't be reasonable to try and involve pediatrics to some extent with your project. I think there would be a number of individuals who would be interested in that. And I also wondered whether you mentioned a community effort and certainly Special Olympics. I wondered if also the Council on Developmental Disability, the Kentucky Council on Autism Spectrum Disorders were involved at all with your efforts.
Yes, great questions. Thank you for your comments. So we have started to engage pediatrics more thanks to Dr. Harris. So she's really done a great job of being the link for us. And so, we're always looking for more people to join us and help us with our efforts, particularly with, teaching sessions that we do regularly with the medical school. And so we're happy to take volunteers who want to help us with that, and as well as with other efforts here locally. So for the U of L team, our partners are with Special Olympics Kentucky, as well as Down Syndrome Louisville, as well as the council, and HDI is the Human Development Institute, which is the state's USAID. It's actually located at UK, so it's in Lexington, but this might be one of the few projects where we're working very closely with U of L in UK. So the USAID, the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, their charge really is on disability training, education, and advocacy for the state. So they're on our advisory committee, and we work very closely with them. They come and they give lectures. They are our connection to self-advocates, and they're also our connection to the council. So the three sort of pieces are the Kentucky Protection Advocacy, the USAID, the HDI, and then the council, like you mentioned. And so we try to be plugged into that network here within the state. And, to sort of echo your comments about families being fearful, that's definitely something that I know I personally experienced, and it's a very tricky thing for families to navigate. And so we really, appreciate and rely on the efforts of the pediatricians that are having those conversations about transition. And one of the things we've realized is that on the adult side of care, we need to be partners with our pediatrician colleagues so that when they're talking about transition, that there's adult providers to transition to. And so that's another sort of topic that we go through in our sessions at the medical school. I will say, too, another related area is supported decision making. So this also relates to Dr. Schickler's first question. But one of the things that we teach the medical students about is supported decision making. So that's a legal alternative to guardianship. There's been several cases of people in Kentucky who've had their rights restored. So they no longer have a legal guardian, they utilize supported decision making. But so educating physicians more about that, because soon as you see patients, later teens into adulthood, if they elect to use supported decision making, then as physicians, we have to understand what that means and how that has implications for the way we deliver care. So that's another topic that's definitely at the forefront, and relates to, as you're saying, the fears of parents. How to navigate that as you move forward into adulthood. It's definitely a tricky situation.
Thanks.
Thanks for addressing that.
Thank you.
It looks like Dr. Rogers might have a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just turned on my mic. This is really probably for Corey, but I'm wondering whether it's a really exciting, I really enjoyed your grand rounds. I'm wondering whether you guys as a group have been working with the American Board of Pediatrics to try and get some of your content included on board exams. It's usually a fairly rapid way of moving things forward in terms of curriculum.
Well, Dr. Roger, thank you. I think that sounds like a great idea. And as I'm joining, Dr. Chandran and Dr. Noonan have really started this project, and probably about 2 years ago was when I started to join and help with some of the teaching sessions. But I'm always looking for ways that I can contribute and grow the project, and that would be a great idea.
It also looks like there was a question from Dr. Morton in the chat. In what ways has Home of the Innocents been brought into a community engagement?
Home of the Innocents, of course, I spend most of my clinical time here, and I think a number of ways. Our residents participate in MedFest. A number of them participate in Special Olympics. I have used the rotation as a way to teach medical students and residents about our programs. I think involvement of our patients or any of our residents as self-advocates would probably be more challenging, because most of the residents here have more severe intellectual disabilities. But there are a number of residents that I could think of that might enjoy and benefit from being involved in the program. So I think it's a great idea. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an area we should explore, because we are always looking to add more self-advocates. There's so many that are passionate about this activity, and so when you mention, hey, does anyone want to come speak to the medical students? Generally, there's a very positive response to that request. We have also, so specifically at U of L with the NCIDM funding, we created an elective, at least specialty clinic, which is an adult clinic that serves people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So we now have medical students rotating out at that clinic. And when they do, I send them over to Home of the Innocents for pool therapy, but also so that they learn about the pediatric side of things, so that they're able to really learn about changes in services and transition, as well as changes regarding healthcare financing when you move from the pediatric system to the adult system. So Home of the Innocents really is a valuable rotation site for us, and we really appreciate all of the experiential opportunities that exist for our medical students at Home of the Innocents.
All right, if there are no further questions, we're going to wrap things up. Thank you, Dr. Harris, Dr. Chandon, and Dr. Noonan. Everyone have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.